Okay, so what I'm going to show you today is how quickly you can get the back end of a project set up just by building the database and then using GraphQL with Postgraphile. So the example I'm going to use today is just using location, organization, and event. And so events are tied to a location, and events can also be tied to organization. The specific data within these tables isn't so important. It's more important just to see how quickly Postgraphile can be used to set up a GraphQL API rather than having to go build a full REST API. So we'll start off just by quickly copying this. We can go and create a new database. So create DB, and we'll just call it fitness. And then PSQL fitness. So now we've gone ahead and created the database. Let's actually insert the schema. So let's make sure, okay, our tables have all successfully been created. Okay, then we will go ahead and just insert some dummy data to use. Now, into this, I'm just putting some random organizations that I know about with some descriptions and email, link for an image, or a URL for an image. Then location, I'm just using the West Bund here with some basic information. And then events, I've just created one event for each of the two organizations. And then here are just the connections to link the event and their location and the event and the organization. So we can go ahead, copy that, and then just once again quickly insert it. Okay, so let's see, all of those inserted correctly. Okay, perfect. Now what we can do is we use Postgraphile to help us really quickly set up an API for this rather than having to spend a lot of time building out the API with Express and then having to set up all the routes and making sure that the routes on the front end and back end match and everything like that. So to use Postgraphile, all we have to do is npm install global Postgraphile, and then once we've done that, we can just go ahead and run this command. Now, I've already actually installed Postgraphile, so I don't have to do that again. I can just go to the command line and then run this command. Now, we do have to change the name to match the database just created, which I called fitness, and then add on cores, which just allows us to get past cross-origin issues. Okay, so we go ahead and run that command. Then we already have the backend API already set up. So here we get a few extensions here. We see the first one, or this one, ending with just GraphQL. This is where we would actually query the backend. And then we also get this one getting graphical, which gives us a interface or graphical interface to be able to see what our setup is with the database and what our queries are, what our mutations are. So first thing we can do is we can go and look at the documentation. So here we're offered query, which shows us everything that we can already get from our database. So we can already go ask about all the events. We can see the connections between events and locations. We can look at all the organizations. We can get event by ID, location by ID, etc., etc., etc. So let's quickly see how this actually works. So first, let's just maybe let's do all events. So we go ahead and we say all events. Then in there, we can figure out what we need to look for next. So we see next thing we have is nodes, and then inside of the nodes, we actually have our events. And there we can get an event ID, a description. And so one thing you'll notice too is that there's autocomplete for all of this, which is really helpful, makes it really easy to explore the API. So if the people building front end and back end are separated, or they're not always working that tightly together, it's really easy for front end people to be able to figure out what they're able to access on the back end. So yeah, that auto completion in this documents is really helpful for that. Okay, so let's see, we have our ID, our description. Let's do start time, end time, And yeah, let's just do that for now. So right away we see that we've gotten all of this data back. We have the ID for our events, and so right now we only have these two events, first one, second event in our database. But yeah, we get our ID, our description, our start time, our end time. But maybe we decide, hey, I don't really need the start time and end time. I first want to see the description, and then maybe if I click on the description later on, give me other data. So we can go ahead and just remove start time, end time, run that again, and all of a sudden this is the only data we're getting back. Now, in addition to the queries, we also have mutations. And so here you can see right away we can do all of these mutations with our database, and it's really easy to figure out how to do all of this stuff because everything is laid out for you. It's auto-documenting, so basically you click on what the inputs are that you need to do. And so for the event, create an event, you have to give an event input. It tells you which of these is needed and not needed. So the documentation really sets you up to be able to work really quickly on the front end without having to know exactly what the back end has done up to this point, because this Postgraphile automatically sets that all up for you. Later on, so the first thing you can do is you can set up this Postgraphile and just run it directly from your terminal like this, or run it on a server like this. But ultimately what you can do is you can move it to work with Express as middleware, and then you can customize it however you want. You can use a lot of other middleware with it as well. But you see that in just the matter of a few minutes I was able to create my database. As soon as I have a database schema, I have all this information at my fingertips on the front end. So that allows for us to really start building the front end out very quickly as soon as we have any data. And there's not this worry of having to build 20, 30, 40 routes on the back end just to start getting some basic data. And then if on the front end, let's say I wanted to, once again, add start time here, I wouldn't have to go and tell the backend guys, hey guys, build me another route. But instead, right away, I can just go ahead and do that, and I'm not overfetching or underfetching any data. So now let's take a look at how this actually connects with the front end. Okay, so now we can go ahead and take a look at how this actually works on the front end, because we've seen that we can go ahead and get our information through this graphical interface. But if we actually want to use it on the front end, there's a slightly different approach. We still use the same querying form, but there's a couple of extra tools that we need along with GraphQL. So let's go over to the code here, and then I can show you what we need exactly. So first of all, we need to use, for instance here, I'm using React Apollo, but it doesn't specifically have to be React. There's some other ways to do it. So I have to set up the query. So just like before, here I'm setting up the query with that same general structure of getting things. In this case, I have a ID here, and it's fairly simple to do that, and you can actually do it in the graphical interface as well. You can go ahead, and here you see org ID. This is a variable that I used earlier in some tests I was doing. So we can go ahead and, let's see, where is that? Okay, so we have our query, then we go ahead and we pass our query into this query object, which then goes ahead and passes data down to its children. So for instance here, when it's still loading, this will give a non-null response. When there is an error, there will be a non-null response. And finally, when the data is actually returned, data will stop being null. So here, this is a really quick way to actually show the phases of fetching data. As we go through this process, it'll show loading and error, and then once we've gone, or loading, and if there is no error, then it'll move over here and show us the data. So this isn't too important. I'm basically just going through the data and getting out the parts I want. So specifically here, I want to map out events and do it by organization. So once I've gotten the data returned, I go ahead and I map it quickly into this event component, which you can see here, and then I just go ahead and I put the start time, the end time, the description, and the location. And so if we actually look at that, just here on the front end, we can see it goes ahead and it fetches that data for me. And in this case, I've actually just hard-coded in the ID used. Now, obviously, in an application, you wouldn't actually do that, but I haven't built this front end out enough to first go get an ID or get an ID when I've fetched the lists of organizations and then pass it on. But yeah, ultimately, you wouldn't want to have the ID here as just a hard-coded string.